Hi, I'm the son they forgot, the one they pitied. Right after my father's funeral, my wife filed for divorce. 2 weeks later, she married my cousin, my closest family. They thought I was left with nothing. No money, no power, no future. But they didn't know who my father really was. They didn't know what he'd built in silence. And they had no idea what silence can do. When it's not weakness, but a weapon. So ask yourself, what happens when the quiet one finally speaks? I arrived before the sun had fully settled into the sky. The parking lot was still half empty, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. Gray clouds hung low, not dramatic, just tired. The church sat the way it always had. Brick walls dulled by time, steps worn smooth by decades of Sunday shoes. Men from the factory stood near the entrance in jackets that had seen better years. They nodded when they saw me. No words, just recognition. My father would have liked that. No fuss, no performance. To most people, he had been a simple factory worker. Clock in, clock out. 30 years on the same line. He never corrected anyone who saw him that way. He believed work spoke for itself. That morning, all I could think about was that I wouldn't hear his boots by the door again. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about family roles. I was thinking about how quiet my phone had been since he passed, and how loud that silence felt. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. I signed the guest book with a pen that barely worked. My name looked smaller than I remembered it being. I stood there a moment, staring at it, then moved on. An usher approached me with a soft smile. Polite, careful. She asked me to step to the side for a moment. I assumed it was about timing, or maybe seating. I followed without thinking. That's something I've always done. Follow. Keep things smooth. The front row was already filling. Reserved signs rested neatly on the pews. Immediate family. I scanned the names. I didn't see mine. I waited, expecting someone to fix it. No one did. The usher gestured toward a seat farther back. Not rude, not firm. Just a gentle redirection, like moving a chair out of the way. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Today wasn't the day to create discomfort. That's what I told myself. Today was about my father. I sat where I was guided, hands folded, eyes forward. From there, I watched my cousin step into place near the front. He spoke quietly with the funeral director. He nodded at the pastor. People approached him with questions, and he answered easily, like he belonged there. Someone handed him a folder. He took it without hesitation. When condolences began, he stood beside the casket and spoke on behalf of the family. His voice was steady, familiar. People listened. A few glanced in my direction, confused for a second, then looked away. No one corrected anything. Not him, not my wife, not me. It wasn't dramatic. That was the worst part. It felt natural to everyone else, like a decision made long ago that I had somehow missed. After the service, I stayed behind to help gather my father's things, his coat, his watch, small pieces of a life that had never asked for attention. At the bottom of a box, I found his old metal lunch pail, dented, heavy, the latch stiff from years of use. He carried it every day for 3 decades, never replaced it. I ran my thumb along the edge and felt a quiet pull in my chest. I set it down carefully, like it could hear me. I told myself again that this wasn't about me. Families break when someone speaks at the wrong time. I'd learned that lesson early. Silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. It kept the peace. It kept things moving. As people filtered out, someone clapped my cousin on the shoulder and thanked him for taking care of everything. I was standing right there, close enough to hear, close enough to matter if anyone had been looking. No one was. I felt it then. Not anger. Not yet. Just the sense that something fundamental had shifted, and I was the only one who hadn't been told. I thought the funeral was the hardest part. I didn't know the real burial hadn't even started yet. The house hadn't changed, but something in it had. The air inside felt untouched, like no one had moved in days. No footsteps, no new scents, no flickers of life, just silence, heavy and full, the kind that creeps into the corners and settles on your chest. My black suit was still hanging on the back of the chair in the living room, the one near the window where my dad used to sit and read newspapers. I hadn't folded it. I hadn't moved it. The fabric was wrinkled now, soft from the way I'd slouched in it for hours at the funeral and then just left it there like it carried too much weight to touch. I didn't cry. Not then. Grief hadn't settled into tears. It lived as a dull ache in my bones, a sense of being hollowed out. I kept thinking someone might call, or knock, or text, but no one did. The last casserole dish from a neighbor had been dropped off the day before. After that, nothing. 3 days. That's all it had been. She came into the room just after breakfast, though I hadn't eaten anything. I was nursing a cold cup of coffee, not even tasting it. She stood near the entry to the kitchen, arms crossed but not defensive. Her voice was low, even rehearsed. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded, thinking it was about Dad, maybe about the service, maybe about the will, though none of us had spoken about it yet. "This isn't about your father," she began. That threw me a little, but I said nothing. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." Her words didn't rise. They didn't tremble. They landed like folded laundry, neat, soft, prepared. I thought maybe she meant we needed time away, or that she was struggling with the grief too. I told myself that. I believed it for a second. She looked me in the eye, and I saw the distance. The way people look at someone when they've already packed their emotions into boxes. "I can't live like this anymore," she said. "I need something stable, solid." I sat still. I heard her, but the meaning didn't land right away. I want a divorce. No yelling, no tears, no slam drawers or angry declarations, just a quiet exit plan. Twist S3, right there on the kitchen floor, next to my cold coffee. She spoke like someone reading off a script she'd practiced in her head. I need something different. I felt this way for a while. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask what this way meant. I didn't ask if she had talked to someone. I didn't ask if she still loved me. What would have been the point? After a pause, I asked, "Is there someone else?" Her eyes dropped for the briefest second, just long enough to tighten something in my chest. She nodded, slow. It's Marcus." I blinked. "Marcus?" I repeated. "My cousin." The silence between us cracked wide open. "He's been there for me," she said, as if that explained it. "We've been talking for a while." I didn't ask how long a while meant. She glanced away. "We're planning a small ceremony. Just courthouse stuff. We haven't told anyone yet." Twist S4. The wedding already had a date. They'd waited until the ground was closed, until the last of the flowers wilted on my father's grave. That's when they decided I didn't matter anymore. I felt my lungs tighten, but I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even say his name again. I thought I'd feel rage, but what settled was quieter. Something like humiliation, wrapped in shame, dipped in disbelief. She began packing that afternoon. There wasn't much to sort. She already knew what she wanted to take. A few boxes, her clothes, her laptop, some old photo albums. No hesitation. Before leaving, she stood at the door. "I hope we can be respectful about all this," she said. Then she left. No backward glance, no apology. Just the sound of the door clicking shut. And there I was. No father, no wife, not even a space at the front row of my own life. I didn't realize then that losing my wife wasn't the real betrayal. It was only the beginning. It crept in slowly. The feeling that I'd somehow stepped out of frame while everyone else kept rehearsing a scene I was no longer part of. 2, maybe 3 weeks had passed since she left. I can't say for sure because the days stopped meaning anything. I woke up. I went to work. I came home. I pretended to watch television. I slept. Then it started again. If there were calls, I didn't hear them. If there were texts, they didn't come to me. What struck me wasn't just the quiet, but who had filled the space I left behind. My cousin, Marcus, had somehow become the one people turned to. He answered questions about my father's things. He updated the rest of the family. Even the group chat we had, once used to share Sunday potlucks and old photos, had gone strangely active again, but I wasn't tagged. I read through it sometimes like I was scrolling through someone else's family. Then one afternoon, I got a call from my aunt. "There's a small thing happening at the house," she said, her voice low and sweet, the kind of tone people use when they know they're calling too late. "Just sorting through some of your dad's stuff. Marcus thought you might want to stop by." I said sure, though I already knew I wasn't meant to arrive early. When I pulled up to my father's place, my place now, technically, there were already cars lined up in the driveway and along the curb. The living room lights were on. Inside, I could see silhouettes moving, heads nodding, hands pointing. By the time I walked in, there were folders on the coffee table, stacks of paper I hadn't seen before. Marcus stood at the center of it all, holding a sheet, reading off dates and names as if he'd rehearsed them. He looked up and greeted me with a quick smile. "Hey, glad you made it." Someone shifted to make room for me. Not at the table, but at the edge of the couch. I sat without saying anything. Twist S5 didn't come as a punch. It came as a shrug. I was there, technically, but I wasn't in it. The documents had already been reviewed, the stories already told. Marcus talked about what Dad would have wanted and the best use of remaining funds, and people nodded. When someone asked if the house would go on the market, he said, "We're thinking about it." Not, "We're all talking about it." Just, "We're thinking." I bit my tongue. I reminded myself, this wasn't the moment to start a war. Later, when coffee was poured and people loosened their voices, an older cousin, Aunt Joe's son, said something that stuck harder than anything else that evening. "Well, I mean, at least he helped when he could," he said casually, looking in my direction, especially near the end. There was no malice in his tone. That made it worse. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said he was there every weekend. Nobody added that I'd driven my father to nearly every appointment those last 6 months, that I'd worked graveyard shifts so I could be around during the day, that I'd skipped my own anniversary dinner, one I didn't realize would be the last, just to sit in that hospital hallway. Twist S7 didn't scream. It sighed. He helped when he could. That's what I was to them. A helper. A visitor. A footnote. I didn't correct anyone. What would have been the point? That night, I sat in my car for a long time before going home. I didn't cry. I didn't hit the steering wheel like they do in movies. I just stared at the dashboard and started pulling up memories like files in a drawer. Thanksgiving, where I brought 2 pies, but wasn't asked to carve the turkey. My brother's wedding, where I gave the toast, but people kept saying Marcus should have been the one to speak. The family reunion, where they forgot to print my name on the t-shirt order. Was I ever at the center, or was I always orbiting other people's stories? I got home, turned on the porch light, walked inside. My father's lunch pail still sat on the shelf near the back door, the one he used to rest his keys on when he came in. It was still dented in the corner, still had a faint oil smell if you opened it. I stood there, looking at it, remembering how he never corrected people either. When they got things wrong about him, he'd just nod, smile, move on. But he never let anyone speak for him. Not once. I thought about that. Thought about the difference between being quiet and being absent. The next morning, I didn't check the group chat. I didn't return any messages. I didn't go to the diner where the cousins met up every other Sunday. But something had shifted. It was small, maybe even invisible to anyone else. But I felt it. They weren't pushing me out with force. They were writing me out with politeness. And silence? Silence was the ink. I understand now. If you don't take your place in a story, someone else will. I didn't know it yet, but the truth was already there, buried in places no one thought to look. The next time I opened the old garage, the air hit me like a memory, stale, thick with oil and sawdust, the same way it had smelled when I was a boy watching my dad clean his tools on Sunday evenings. The light through the high windows had shifted golden, late afternoon pressing shadows against the walls. I hadn't planned on being there that day. I'd driven past the house twice before finally turning in. Something in me wanted to see it, to feel close to him again, maybe. Or maybe I was just avoiding the silence of my own place. The garage hadn't changed. Same warped pegboards, same cracked cement floor. His workbench was still cluttered, rags, screws, metal scraps. To anyone else, it would have looked like a life that belonged to a man who'd lived simply and died quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. I started sorting through boxes with no real goal. Just moving, just touching. Each item I picked up was familiar, though none of it told me more about who he'd been. Uniforms folded so neatly they looked pressed, receipts from the hardware store, an old clipboard with a grocery list from years ago still clipped to it. He never talked much about work. When I was a kid, I asked him once what he did all day at the plant. He just said, "Fix what's broken. Try not to break what's not." I remember thinking that was either really smart or really tired. The rusted red toolbox sat beneath the bench, heavier than I remembered. I bent down, grabbed the handle, and lifted it onto the table with a thud. It had stickers from the 80s on the lid, half-peeled logos of baseball teams, and a faded Proud Union decal. When I opened it, the familiar creak echoed off the walls. The top layer was what you'd expect. Wrenches, a socket set, tangled wires. But under that, beneath a rag stiff with years of grease, something crinkled. It was paper, folded tight, tucked deliberately under weight, like someone wanted it found only by someone who knew where to look. I wiped my hands on my jeans before picking it up. The paper was thick, not notebook paper, legal stock, the kind you use when you want permanence. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a will, not a deed, but it had structure, lists, dates, names. Some were underlined, others crossed out. There was a section marked Transitional Control, followed by a series of initials I didn't recognize. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe something from work, a project, a side hustle. Maybe he helped someone manage inventory and didn't want Mom to know. But the dates didn't line up. The addresses listed weren't from around here. Before I could think too much, I heard the side door open. "Still smells the same in here," a voice said. I turned. It was Frank, my dad's old coworker. The man had retired years ago, but still swung by to check on the house, as he put it. Mostly he just missed talking to someone who still remembered the plant before they cut corners. He stepped in slowly, glancing around like it had been longer than it really was. "Didn't expect to see you," he said, then noticed the paper in my hand. His face didn't change much, but I saw the flicker. That 1 second of recognition he couldn't pull back fast enough. "Found something?" he asked, casual. "Just some old notes," I said. Frank stepped closer, squinting. "Huh." He didn't reach for it, didn't ask to see, just nodded once and said, soft, "Your dad never wanted you mixed up in that side of his life." That sentence hit like a slow-motion punch. That side. I opened my mouth to ask, but Frank had already turned toward the shelf, pretending to look at an old radio that hadn't worked since I was 15. He meant well, he added. Always did. Then he changed the subject. Asked if the heater in the house still worked. If I'd gotten the plumbing checked. Mundane, safe topics. We talked for 10 more minutes before he left, and he never once circled back to what he'd said. After he was gone, I sat alone on the stool by the workbench, the paper still in my hands. I didn't feel excited. Not even curious, really. What I felt was wary. Like I'd stepped into a room that wasn't meant for me. My father hadn't wanted me involved. And now I had to wonder, why? That night, I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found. I didn't mention the papers or Frank's reaction. I just went home and slid the documents into the back of my filing cabinet behind tax forms and expired insurance. For the first time since the funeral, I chose silence. Not because I felt small, but because I wanted to watch. If this was only a piece of the truth, I needed to know why he hid the rest. That's how I ended up sitting in a downtown office that smelled faintly of fresh carpet and copy toner. The chairs were too soft, the air conditioning too cold for a March morning. It didn't feel like a place where my father's name belonged. He never wore a tie unless someone died. I had called the number listed on one of the folded documents tucked in the toolbox. It led me to a financial advisory office, not a bank, not a law firm, but some hybrid of the two. I didn't expect much, probably leftover paperwork, maybe a dormant account with a few $100. The receptionist greeted me like I was expected. That's what threw me first. Then came a man in a navy suit with silver hair and the kind of voice that could convince you you'd always known him. He introduced himself as Mr. Langford, the estate consultant. Behind him was a woman with glasses who barely spoke and carried a laptop like it was her weapon of choice. They led me to a glass room, poured coffee I didn't ask for, and slid a folder in front of me. "Before we begin," Langford said, folding his hands, "we want to acknowledge your loss." I nodded. I didn't come for sympathy. They began speaking in calm, measured tones. Trust transfers, investment portfolios, capital distributions. I kept waiting for them to realize they had the wrong man. None of it sounded like my father. This was a man who used paper clips to fix broken zippers. Langford opened a file and adjusted his glasses. "We've been managing your father's private assets for over 22 years under the Beckett-Fallon umbrella." I blinked. "I don't know what that is." "It's a shell structure for high-value holdings." He kept it separate from his public earnings. He said it like someone explaining the weather. I couldn't follow. Then the number came out. Quiet, clean, just a statement in the middle of a longer sentence. And the estimated valuation of the Beckett-Fallon portfolio as of last quarter stands at $599 million. He kept talking. I didn't hear the rest. I stared at the line item printed on the document. 599,000 here. I checked again. My brain refused to process it. I'd thought maybe a small inheritance, a savings account, something modest. That was the kind of man my father was, or at least who I thought he was. My stomach didn't flip. My hands didn't shake. What came instead was a slow, tightening dread. Because if that number was real, that meant everyone I knew had no idea who he truly was, including me. Langford paused. We understand this can be overwhelming. I nodded. It wasn't the size that scared me. It was the implication. My dad had built a life no one knew existed, and kept it secret, even from me. I thought of my cousin, of my ex-wife, of the timing of their conversations. I thought of the family suddenly warming up again after weeks of silence. Who else knows about this? I asked. Langford glanced at the woman, then back at me. Only those listed as beneficiaries. You are the primary. We've had no contact with any other party. Then came the second blow. Not a number this time, but advice. I would recommend you not disclose this to anyone yet, Langford said. Not out of secrecy, but control. People adjust their behavior quickly in the presence of perceived opportunity. He didn't need to explain what he meant. They think I'm still in the dark. I left the office with a binder under my arm and a storm brewing under my skin. The street felt louder, the sun too bright. I sat in my car for a few minutes before turning the engine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had 3 missed calls. My aunt, a cousin I hadn't spoken to since Christmas, and my ex-wife. No messages, just calls, like they didn't want to leave a record. That night, I noticed something else, the invitations. Just wanted to check in. Maybe we could catch up. Your family, that still matters. No one mentioned money, but their tone had changed. Too careful, too upbeat, like they were playing a game they thought I hadn't figured out yet. I decided right then. I wouldn't correct them. Not yet. Let them think I'm still the same man who stood quietly at the funeral, who stepped aside at the will reading, who never raised his voice when they talked over him. Let them think silence means confusion. I wanted to see who'd try to rewrite history, and who'd stay quiet, hoping I never read the footnotes. I was halfway through reviewing the binder again at home when my phone buzzed. My cousin. How you holding up, man? Right on cue. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Doing all right, I said, voice flat but polite. He made small talk, asked about sleep, food, the usual checkpoints of concern. I didn't offer much back, just enough to keep the mask steady. That call led to dinner. Nothing big, he said. Just some family catching up. It was held at my aunt's house, the same one who once said I helped when I could at the funeral. The place looked just like it always had. A little too much faux wood paneling. The same scent of lemon cleaner and pot roast. Familiar enough to make you lower your guard. I didn't. From the moment I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't a gathering. It was a temperature check. Everyone smiled too wide. Their hugs lingered half a second too long. The room buzzed with a kind of rehearsed ease, like they'd practiced being warm. Look who's finally out of hiding, my older cousin chuckled. A few laughs followed. I smiled and said nothing. Dinner was pot roast, of course, mashed potatoes, green beans, everything laid out like a holiday meal without the holiday. I sat at the far end of the table, not because there wasn't space, but because I wanted the view. I needed to watch. They asked how I was doing, how work was, if I was thinking of any next steps. They didn't say what kind of steps. They didn't need to. It wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance dressed as concern. The shift was clear. Kindness had an aftertaste now. Then the door opened, and she walked in. My ex-wife. Hair styled soft, like she hadn't just ripped my world apart a month ago. She smiled like the room belonged to her. She didn't look surprised to see me. She came right over. "Hey," she said gently, as if the last words she'd spoken to me hadn't been about leaving for someone else. I nodded. "Didn't know you'd be here." She gave a little laugh. "Well, families shift. I guess I'm still part of this one somehow." I didn't answer. Over dinner, she kept it light. Talked about her new place, how work had been hectic, how sorry she was to hear about my dad again. Said it must have been hard. All that weight on your shoulders. I looked at her. Really looked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were searching. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to see what I knew, or what I didn't. And then she said it. Out of nowhere, between bites of green beans and a sip of wine. "I didn't leave because you were broke," she said casually. "I left because you were stuck." The words didn't land like a slap. They cut quieter than that, like something sharp slipped beneath the skin. I set my fork down. The room quieted without being asked to. I could have exploded, could have reminded her of everything she'd done, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "You didn't leave because I was stuck. You left because you thought I would stay small." She blinked, didn't respond. Silence filled the room. No one laughed. No one defended her. Even my cousin looked away. For the first time, I'd said something that didn't fold. After that, conversation stumbled along. People avoided eye contact. Dessert was served, but no one really ate. My cousin sat across from me, arms crossed loosely, pretending to scroll on his phone. But he was watching. He always watched. Only now, there was something new in his face. Calculation. A quiet pivot. The look of someone adjusting strategy. He hadn't expected me to draw a line. And now that I had, he'd need to decide what to do with it. I stayed an hour longer. Didn't say much. Let them stew in the discomfort of a man they thought they understood. Changing shape right in front of them. Later, walking to my car, I played the scene back in my head. This wasn't peace. This wasn't healing. This was positioning. And I was finally in the game. Not just surviving the rules, but rewriting some of them. I understood something as I pulled the door shut behind me. Silence invited replacement. But boundaries force a reaction. And I wasn't afraid of that anymore. A week passed. Calm on the surface. Nothing big enough to be called trouble, yet everything carried a scent of tension, like the air before a thunderstorm that never quite arrives. But you know it will. People started reaching out. Cousins, aunts, folks I hadn't spoken to in months. Each call, each message, wore the same coat of friendliness, but walked on different shoes. Invitations came not with warmth, but purpose. One of them was for a small local fundraiser. A community thing, they said, tied to the factory, to my father's legacy. Would mean a lot if you showed up, someone added. So I did. It was held in the back room of a local community center, just off Main Street. Folding chairs, paper name tags, soft punch in plastic cups. Nothing elegant, but nothing casual either. I scanned the room as I entered, and it didn't take long to spot the familiar rhythm of practiced coordination. My cousin stood near the front, talking to two older board members. His posture said confidence. His hands moved just enough to emphasize without overselling. He was good. I'll give him that. He looked like the guy who'd kept the ship steady after the captain died. I stayed near the back for a while, long enough to observe how people approached him, how they listened. When I finally stepped closer, the conversation shifted. Someone smiled and said, "We were just talking about how proud your father would be." I nodded. I think about that a lot. My cousin took the moment. "He built something special," he said, voice just loud enough to carry. "And we're doing everything we can to carry that forward. Together." Together. It rolled off his tongue easily. And yet, nowhere in the brochures scattered on the welcome table did my name appear. No mention of me in the event agenda. No recognition beyond a handshake and half a glance. At one point, during a small breakout circle, plans were being discussed. Ideas to expand the foundation, redirect some assets, tie certain projects back to core family values. That's when a man I didn't know, maybe early 50s, wearing a navy blazer too tight across the shoulders, raised his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, looking around. "Before we finalize anything, shouldn't we hear from the actual owner?" Silence. For a moment, it felt like the temperature dropped in the room. My cousin didn't speak. Neither did I. Eyes turned toward me. Faces twitched. The kind of pause that reveals more than any argument ever could. One woman cleared her throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. My cousin gave a half laugh and muttered, "Well, we're all family here." But the crack had formed. I said nothing, just looked around slowly, letting the weight of the moment fill the space. Panic wears expensive perfume in rooms like that. It smiles wider, nods more enthusiastically. Suddenly, people were overly interested in what I thought, asking my opinion on things they'd never included me in before. But it wasn't curiosity. It was damage control. They thought I might say something, declare a position, lay claim. I didn't. I simply observed. And it worked better than any speech. After the gathering ended, I saw clusters form by the coffee table. My cousin leaned in close with two of the organizers, whispering. Phones appeared. A few glances shot in my direction, quickly diverted when I met their eyes. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table, the lights off, my father's lunch pail still perched quietly on the bookshelf nearby, dented, plain, unchanged. It had once meant simplicity to me. Now it whispered caution. I knew then. The pushback wasn't over. I'd broken the rhythm. Their dance required a passive partner. Now that I'd stepped out of line, they were already choreographing their next move. They wouldn't confront me directly. That would risk exposure. No, they'd try to reframe the story, rewrite the version of events they'd been building. And they'd do it with smiles. They wouldn't confront me directly. That would risk exposure. No, they'd try to reframe the story, rewrite the version of events they'd been building. And they'd do it with smiles. I found out how loud those smiles could be the next morning. My phone was vibrating before my alarm went off. Missed calls. Text messages stacked on top of each other. A few emails marked urgent. Even before I opened anything, I felt it in my chest. That sharp awareness that something had shifted while I was asleep. By the time I sat up, I knew my name was moving without me. A message from a former colleague read, "Hey, just checking in. Some things being said don't sound right." Another from a distant relative asked if I was okay and whether the rumors were true. Rumors. I opened a local business forum first, then a community newsletter, then a forwarded email thread I wasn't supposed to see. The words repeated themselves with small variations, like they'd been rehearsed. I was unstable. I was overwhelmed. I was unprepared to manage what my father left behind. Every sentence was wrapped in concern. Every accusation carried the tone of care. No one called me corrupt or greedy. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they questioned my capacity, my judgment, my mental state after everything I'd been through. It was clean, calculated, and aimed at one outcome: removing me without looking like villains. By mid-morning, the story had traction. People I barely knew were discussing my future like it was a committee decision. A few suggested temporary oversight. Others hinted at appointing someone more experienced to protect the legacy until I was ready. I understood the move immediately. If they couldn't replace me quietly, they'd disqualify me publicly. I closed my laptop and sat still for a long moment. The old version of me would have swallowed it, waited it out, trusted that truth eventually rose on its own. But truth doesn't rise. It has to be placed. I drove to the law office just before noon. No sirens, no drama, just traffic, red lights, the normal rhythm of a weekday. It felt strange that something so ordinary could sit next to something so destructive. Inside, the air was cool and neutral. My attorney greeted me without panic. That mattered. He didn't ask if the accusations were true. He already knew they weren't. We reviewed what was being said, where it was spreading, who was amplifying it. Names surfaced, familiar ones, including my cousins. I had a choice to make, and I knew it. I could respond emotionally and look defensive, or I could stay silent and let the narrative calcify. Instead, I chose the third option. I asked for a meeting, not a press conference, not a public statement, a formal session with the people who mattered: legal counsel, board representatives, and a few community stakeholders who'd been loudest about concerns. We met that afternoon in a plain conference room: glass table, neutral walls, coffee no one touched. They spoke first. Careful language, soft voices, phrases like "out of respect" and "best interests." One woman said she was worried I'd been carrying too much grief to think clearly. Another man suggested my father might have intended safeguards I didn't fully understand. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. When they finished, I slid a folder onto the table. Inside were documents they hadn't accounted for: independent audits, signed authorizations, a timeline that showed exactly when decisions had been made, and by whom. Clear evidence that my father hadn't just trusted me. He'd prepared me. The room went quiet. No one asked questions at first. They just read. Confidence drained quickly when facts stopped cooperating. Someone cleared their throat. Another adjusted their glasses and flipped pages faster, like speed might change what was written. My cousin finally spoke. He tried to reframe, to soften. Said intentions had been misunderstood. Claimed he'd only stepped in to help when things felt uncertain. I looked at him then, really looked, and I said one sentence: "Helping doesn't require erasing the person you're claiming to protect." That was it. No accusation, no anger. Just a line drawn where ambiguity used to live. The meeting ended shortly after. There was nothing left to debate. Winning didn't look like celebration. It looked like silence, the kind that settles after noise collapses under its own weight. I walked out alone into the late afternoon light. My phone was quiet for the first time all day. The lie had lost its momentum, and the truth, once placed, didn't need defending. For the first time, the truth wasn't fragile anymore. It didn't need me to protect it. It stood on its own. Weeks passed, then months, not with drama, but with the kind of quiet that takes time to trust. No more statements to prepare, no calls from reporters, no meetings with lawyers, just silence, the real kind. I slept better. The inbox got lighter. My name stopped showing up in forwarded emails. The accusations faded like smoke after a fire no one bothered to keep alive. The people who once whispered with urgency had moved on to other topics. Their tone shifted from attack to avoidance. Life, for once, felt still. My cousin no longer held any visible position tied to my father's legacy. His name was quietly removed from documents, plaques, event programs. He didn't fight it, not publicly. He knew the game was over. His circle shrank, and so did the weight of his opinion. As for my ex-wife, she remarried quickly. Not to my cousin, surprisingly. Someone with less history and more money, or maybe just less baggage. We haven't spoken since that dinner. She left the story cleanly, the way some people exit a room they've already judged too small for them. Family ties didn't bounce back either. Calls stayed rare. Messages stayed short. Birthdays passed with polite texts. There was no great reckoning, no emotional closure. But I wasn't angry. I'd stopped mistaking proximity for connection. The justice that arrived wasn't loud. It didn't knock anyone down or put anyone in their place. It simply changed who had access to what. Access to decisions, to resources, to legacy, and dignity. That remained intact. I didn't strip it from them because I finally understood. People undo themselves better than any punishment ever could. I didn't need a headline or revenge. I just needed space. And time gave me that. It was on one of those ordinary days when I was cleaning out an old cabinet that I saw it again. The lunch pail. My father's old metal box sat tucked behind some paperwork, dusty but familiar. I hadn't looked at it since the day of the funeral. I pulled it out and placed it on the table, ran my hand across the dented side, opened it slowly. Empty. Of course it was. But that lunch pail wasn't about food. It was about consistency. He carried it every day for 30 years, through rain, heat, layoffs, and overtime. He never replaced it, never upgraded. It was part of his rhythm. Back then, I didn't understand his silence. I mistook it for distance. Now I know better. He didn't keep quiet because he had nothing to say. He kept quiet because he knew how easily truth gets twisted when spoken too soon. He worked steady because noise doesn't build anything. He didn't need applause. He built a life so that I wouldn't have to beg for mine. I didn't build a foundation in his name. I didn't slap our last name on a scholarship fund. I didn't create a business empire with his image framed on the wall. Instead, I started smaller. I invested in quiet people. I paid off mortgages for families who didn't know I'd heard their stories. I funded community programs where no one had to perform gratitude in exchange. No press, no speech. I didn't use the money to be seen. I used it to stop being erased. And I chose work that didn't drain me. Projects that didn't need to impress anyone but left something useful behind. Some days I teach. Some days I listen. Some days I rest. That's wealth too. Family looks different now. It isn't bound by blood or childhood obligations. It's defined by presence, by choice. It doesn't ask me to shrink or disappear. I no longer chase a chair at tables where I was once barely tolerated. If I'm not welcome, I don't return. If I am, I bring all of me, without apology. And maybe that's the lesson my father knew I'd have to earn for myself. To the ones listening, maybe because you've been the quiet one, or the underestimated one, or the person who let others speak first for too long, this part is for you. You don't have to prove yourself to people who decided long ago they wouldn't see you. But one day, you will decide what your silence means, and who it serves, and when it ends. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I refused to disappear. Some scars stay. They don't need to fade. They just need to stop bleeding. And one day, they will. I stopped trying to prove my worth. And that's when my life finally began.